Hello everyone, and thank you for choosing to spend your evening here with me. If you enjoy these stories, I'd truly appreciate your subscription, like, and comment. It only takes a second for you, but it means the world to me and helps make each video even better. Now, get comfortable and let's begin. For nearly 6 centuries, a small country on the edge of Europe ruled over territories stretching across 4 continents. From the rainforests of Brazil to the spice ports of India, from the coasts of West Africa to enclaves in China, the Portuguese Empire was the first truly global empire in history. But how did a nation that numbered fewer than 2 million people at the time become a colonial power, with outposts thousands of miles apart? How did this empire rise, flourish, and eventually collapse? It is a story that begins in the 12th century with the birth of Portugal as a kingdom, and unfolds through medieval crusades, the epic of the great geographical discoveries, the peak of European imperial competition, and finally, the post-colonial revolutions of the 20th century. In this journey, we will study the motives that drove Portuguese expansion, the search for trade routes, religious zeal, political survival, and economic ambition. We will meet the navigators, kings, merchants, missionaries, and rebels who shaped this path. We will consider not only the power Portugal possessed, but also the resistance it encountered, and the legacy it left behind. This is not just a story of conquest and wealth. It is a story of decisions made over centuries of global encounters, and of an empire that helped define the face of the modern world, long before it disappeared from its map. Let's begin. The history of the Portuguese Empire begins not with ships at sea or spices from Asia. It begins on land, with the struggle for independence. At the beginning of the 12th century, the territory that would become Portugal was merely a border region in the western part of the Iberian Peninsula, squeezed between powerful kingdoms and caught in a long struggle between Christian and Muslim forces. In 1139, a young nobleman named Afonso Henriques proclaimed himself king after defeating his own mother's troops in battle. At the time, he was the Count of Portugal, a vassal territory of the Kingdom of Len. But Afonso wanted more than just a title. He wanted sovereignty. He conducted a series of successful military campaigns against both Muslim territories in the south and Christian rivals in the north. His most famous triumph was the Battle of Outbreak in 1139, after which he claimed divine patronage for his rule. Shortly thereafter, he proclaimed himself King of Portugal and began seeking recognition from the Pope and neighboring monarchs. It took decades, but by 1179, the Kingdom of Len officially recognized the independence of Portugal. In the following year, Pope Alexander I issued a bull confirming Portugal's status as a sovereign Christian kingdom. This marked the formal birth of Portugal as a nation-state, the first in Europe to establish its nearly modern borders so early in its history. Geography played a decisive role in shaping Portuguese identity. Bordered by Spain to the east and the Atlantic Ocean to the west, Portugal had limited opportunities for land expansion. Expanding inland meant inevitable conflict with powerful neighbors, but the sea offered opportunities, an open frontier with fewer rivals, especially in a Europe where maritime trade was just beginning to develop. Over the following centuries, the Portuguese began to turn their gaze toward the Atlantic, gradually forming the maritime character that would later define their empire. In the 13th century, Portuguese kings focused on expanding lands to the south during the Reconquista. Christian efforts to reclaim territories from Muslim rule. Under Kings Santo I and Afonso I, Portuguese troops reached their Algarve, completing the conquest of their modern territory by 1249. In the same year, a treaty with Castile confirmed the borders of Portugal, boundaries that remain practically unchanged to this day. Once the southern lands were secured, attention turned inland. In the 14th century, King Denis I, also known as the Farmer King, contributed to the development of agriculture, the reorganization of royal lands, and the development of education. But one of his most important contributions lay in the field of navigation. In the early 1300s, he founded the Portuguese Navy, laying the institutional foundation for future maritime achievements. Portuguese society during this period remained predominantly rural and feudal. The nobility owned vast lands, and the church possessed great power. Yet towns grew. Lisbon, Porto, and Coimbra began to turn into centers of trade and governance. Merchants, artisans, and sailors gained influence. These urban changes would later become a pillar for Portugal's overseas enterprises. Meanwhile, external events also shaped the Portuguese worldview. In the Mediterranean, Italian city-states like Venice and Genoa dominated. Muslim powers controlled much of North Africa and the vital land routes to Asia. Northern Europe was growing economically, and competition for trade routes was intensifying. The Portuguese, isolated at the far western edge of Europe, began to think about new routes to replace traditional ones. If they could not control the land routes to the east, perhaps they could reach it by sailing around. Culturally, the Portuguese kingdom was deeply Catholic. The spirit of the Reconquista crusades blended with royal policy and national identity. Religion would later become a justification for overseas expansion, presented not only as commerce but as a divine mission. At this early stage, these ideas had already begun to take shape. However, difficulties remained. The 14th century brought instability. In 1348, the Black Death came to Portugal, destroying perhaps a third of the population. In many areas, agriculture fell into decline. A labor shortage led to a redistribution of economic power, weakening the old feudal order. Social discontent grew. Simultaneously, Portugal found itself embroiled in a conflict over succession after King Ferdinand I died in 1383. Without leaving a male heir, the crisis led to the rise of the Avis dynasty. John, master of the Order of Avis, led a nationalist uprising against Castilian claims to the throne. He won a decisive victory at the Battle of Aljubarrota in 1385. This was not just a military success, it was the defining moment of Portuguese independence. John was crowned as John I, marking the beginning of a new royal house that would lead Portugal into the imperial era. This victory had important consequences. It united much of the nobility and the new dynasty, and strengthened the sense of Portuguese identity and distinction from Castile. King John I strengthened ties with England through the Treaty of Windsor in 1386, one of the oldest diplomatic alliances still in force today. This Anglo-Portuguese alliance would define Portugal's future in both European politics and overseas trade. It was during the reign of John I that the seeds of expansion were sown. He and his queen, Philippa of Lancaster, had several sons who became known as the illustrious generation, figures who would later lead Portuguese explorations. One of them, Prince Henry, would become famous as the Navigator. But even before him, the victory at Aljubarrota and the stability of the Avis dynasty created the conditions necessary for such ambitions. By the end of the 14th century, Portugal was still a small kingdom, but it was independent, stable, and increasingly oriented toward the Atlantic. The sea, once a barrier, was becoming a gateway. At the turn of the 15th century, Portugal was a unified kingdom with stable borders, growing maritime traditions, and a monarchical house that looked beyond the Iberian Peninsula. The victory at Aljubarrota secured the throne for King John I and established the Avis dynasty. This was followed not only by political consolidation, but also by the first steps in Portugal's long journey toward global exploration. Inspired largely by Prince Henrique. Prince Henrique was born in 1394. He was the third son of John I and Philippa of Lancaster. As a younger son, he was not expected to inherit the throne. Instead, he was assigned military, administrative, and spiritual functions. But it was his deep interest in geography, navigation, and expansion that defined his legacy. In 1415, Portugal undertook its first overseas conquest, the capture of the North African city of Ceuta, located on the northern coast of modern Morocco. Ceuta had long been a strategic and commercial hub between Africa and the Mediterranean. Muslim merchants traded gold, ivory, spices, and slaves through its ports. For Portugal, this conquest promised not only religious glory, but also access to wealth. Prince Henrique played a key role in organizing the expedition to Ceuta. Although the long-term value of the city proved limited, it did not provide direct control over trans-Saharan trade routes. It became a turning point. Portugal demonstrated its power beyond its borders. Ceuta became the first foothold in what would later turn into a maritime empire. After Ceuta, Prince Henrique settled in Sogras, in the Algarve region of southern Portugal. While the legendary Sogras school may not have been a formal institution, there is no doubt that Henrique gathered experts around him: navigators, cartographers, shipbuilders, and astronomers, to expand Portugal's knowledge of the seas. These efforts coincided with improvements in maritime technology. The Portuguese perfected the caravel, a small but highly maneuverable sailing vessel capable of sailing against the wind and withstanding long ocean passages. Combined with achievements in cartography and the use of instruments like the astrolabe and compass, Portuguese sailors were able to advance into the Atlantic and along the West African coast, further than any Europeans before them. Prince Henrique's ambitions were to reach the sources of gold and other riches that he believed were located far to the south, beyond the Muslim territories that blocked the path by land. He also had a strong religious motive, the hope of finding Christian allies, perhaps even the mythical Prester John, to resume the crusade against Islam. Beginning in the 1420s, Portuguese ships embarked on a slow, methodical exploration of the West African coast. The first voyages were cautious and limited in scope. Sailors feared the unknown. Superstitions about sea monsters and boiling waters still persisted. But over the years, Portuguese navigators pushed further. In 1434, they reached Cape Beador, which had previously been considered impassable. The successful rounding of the Cape in 1435 by Gillies dispelled old fears and opened the doors to further discoveries. With each new expedition, the Portuguese mapped coastlines, established contact with African societies, and began to acquire goods, primarily gold and slaves. By the 1440s, Portuguese ships reached the Senegal and Gambia rivers. In 1444, they reached Cape Verde, the Green Cape. These voyages were sponsored or encouraged by Prince Henry, who continued to finance research until his death in 1460. It is important to recognize that from the very beginning, exploration was inextricably linked to exploitation. The Portuguese did not just map the coasts, they engaged in commerce, including the nascent Atlantic slave trade. In the 1440s, the Portuguese began capturing or buying enslaved Africans and transporting them to Lisbon. The first public slave auction took place in the city around 1444. This laid the foundation for the transatlantic system of slavery, which would expand colossally in the following centuries. Prince Henry himself profited from this trade. Although his image as the navigator was often romanticized, modern historians emphasize that his motives were mixed: religious, economic, political, and personal. One thing is clear: under his leadership, Portugal became the first European state to consistently explore and exploit the Atlantic and the African coast. Alongside African exploration, the Portuguese began to settle the Atlantic islands. Madeira was discovered around 1419, and its colonization began in the 1420s. The Azores followed in the 1430s. These islands, uninhabited at the time, became testing grounds for plantation economies, especially sugarcane. The Portuguese imported slaves from Africa to work on these plantations, a model that would later be scaled up in Brazil and the Caribbean. The colonization of Madeira and the Azores was also important for strategic reasons. The islands served as naval bases and transit points for ships cruising between Europe and Africa. They also deepened Portugal's experience in managing overseas territories, a skill that would become vital in the coming centuries. By the time of Prince Henry's death in 1460, the foundations of the Portuguese maritime empire had been laid. Portuguese sailors had mapped most of the West African coast. Trading gold, ivory, and people had been established. Key Atlantic islands had been colonized, and a vast amount of navigational knowledge had been accumulated. And yet, at the time of his death, much remained unknown. The southern tip of Africa had not yet been reached. India and the East remained distant and inaccessible by sea, but the direction had been set. Prince Henry opened a new chapter in the history of Portugal, a chapter focused not on the Iberian Peninsula, but on the rest of the world. His work would be continued by future kings and explorers. In the next section, we will follow the dramatic voyages that went beyond West Africa and culminated in the historic rounding of the Cape of Good Hope and arrival in India. In the years after Prince Henry's death, Portuguese expansion did not slow down. On the contrary, it accelerated. The dream of reaching India by sailing around Africa became a national project, driven by a combination of commercial ambitions, religious zeal, and geopolitical necessity. Land routes to Asia were still under the control of Islamic powers and Italian merchants. Portugal, isolated on the edge of Europe, sought to blaze its own path to the riches of the East. King Afonso V, who ruled from 1438 to 1481, continued to sponsor expeditions along the African coast. During his reign, Portuguese navigators reached the Gulf of Guinea and established trade with local African kingdoms. These early missions returned with gold dust, ivory, pepper, and slaves. But the deeper goal, finding a sea route to India, remained elusive. In 1471, a significant figure appeared: Fernão Gomes, a Lisbon merchant who leased the rights to explore parts of the African coast, in exchange for promises of discovery and the payment of tribute. His private expeditions reached the territory of modern Ghana, encountering the rich gold trade of the Akan people. The Portuguese named this area the Gold Coast, and it became one of their first profitable commercial zones in Africa. Meanwhile, the Crown continued to refine its maritime policy. King John E, who began his reign in 1481, adopted a more direct and aggressive approach. Known as the Perfect Prince, John was determined to assert royal control over exploration and complete the route to India. One of John's first actions was the reform of navigation and cartography. He collected new information from returning sailors and commissioned more advanced maps. He also encouraged the use of padres, stone pillars erected by Portuguese navigators along the African coast to claim territory and record their presence. In 1488, a breakthrough occurred. Bartolomeu Dias, a Portuguese nobleman and experienced navigator, was tasked with leading an expedition to advance beyond the known southern limits of Africa. He set sail with 3 ships, following the West African coast and then heading further south than any previous voyage. Dias's fleet encountered severe storms and was driven far out to sea. When they turned back toward the coast, they discovered they had passed the southern tip of Africa. In other words, they had gone beyond the continent and were now on its eastern side. This was a monumental moment. It proved for the first time that the Atlantic and Indian Oceans were connected by water, and that Africa could indeed be circumnavigated. On the way back, Dias identified the southern cape, which he named the Cape of Storms due to the dangerous weather. King John E later renamed it the Cape of Good Hope, symbolizing the optimism that now surrounded Portuguese exploration. The sea route to India was no longer just a dream, it was within reach. However, the journey itself was not yet complete. Dias turned back before reaching India, and many questions remained open. How far was India from the Cape? What lands lay beyond it? What political forces would the Portuguese encounter? By this time, news of Portuguese achievements had reached other parts of Europe. Spain, in particular, began to react. In 1492, Christopher Columbus, sailing under the Castilian flag, reached America while trying to find a western route to Asia. This event created a sense of urgency for the Portuguese crown. King Manuel I, who succeeded John E in 1495 and was known as Manuel the Fortunate, inherited the task of completing the voyage to the Indian Ocean. He chose an experienced and ambitious navigator to lead the expedition, Vasco da Gama. Vasco da Gama came from a noble family in the south of Portugal. He was well versed in mathematics and navigation, and had previously worked on strengthening royal authority along the Portuguese coast. In 1497, he was given command of a fleet of 4 ships with the task of reaching India by sailing around Africa. The expedition left Lisbon in the summer of 1497. It followed the established routes along the West African coast, rounded the Cape of Good Hope in early 1498, and continued up the East African coast. Along the way, da Gama stopped at trading cities such as Mozambique and Mombasa, where he encountered Swahili culture, a mix of African, Arab, and Persian influences. In Malindi, a local sultan provided da Gama with a crucial ally and experienced pilot, likely of Arab or Indian origin, who helped guide the fleet across the Indian Ocean using monsoon winds. In May 1498, da Gama and his fleet arrived in Calicut, a major trading city on the southwestern coast of India. The arrival was historic. For the first time, a European fleet had reached India by sea. The local ruler, known as the Somorin, received da Gama but was not impressed by the Portuguese gifts. Negotiations over trade terms were tense, and many cultural misunderstandings arose. Nevertheless, da Gama managed to conclude a limited trade agreement, and he returned to Portugal in the summer of 1499. The voyage took more than 2 years and cost the lives of many crew members, mainly due to scurvy and other diseases. King Manuel honored da Gama as a hero. The sea route to India was established, and with it, enormous opportunities opened up for trade in spices, textiles, and precious stones. Land routes controlled by Muslim and Venetian merchants could now be bypassed. Portugal positioned itself as a direct link between Europe and Asia. Vasco da Gama's voyage marked the beginning of a new era, not only for Portugal but for the entire world. The balance of global trade was shifting. Europe's connection with Asia was no longer limited to slow and expensive land routes, and Portugal, a small kingdom on the western edge of the continent, made this transformation possible through persistence, innovation, and calculated risk. The consequences were profound. Trade would grow, competition would intensify, and conflicts would become inevitable. In the next section, we will look at how Portugal quickly moved to protect its new sea route and build an empire in the Indian Ocean. When Vasco da Gama secured the sea route to India at the end of the 15th century, Portugal stood on the threshold of a vast and unfamiliar world. Spices such as pepper, cinnamon, and cloves had long been some of the most valuable commodities in Europe, but until then, they reached the continent only through complex and expensive land trade routes controlled by Muslim and Venetian intermediaries. Now, the Portuguese crown sought to take direct control of this trade by establishing a permanent presence in the Indian Ocean. The task was colossal. The Indian Ocean was not an empty space awaiting the arrival of Europeans. It was already a complex and dynamic trade zone connecting East Africa, Arabia, India, Southeast Asia, and China. In ports such as Calicut, Cochin, and Malacca, life was bustling. Merchants, sailors, and rulers conducted a thriving exchange. Muslim, Hindu, Buddhist, and Chinese maritime networks operated independently and efficiently. For Portugal to integrate into this system, it would need more than ships and navigators. It would need strength, strategy, and diplomacy. King Manuel I understood this. After Vasco da Gama's return, the crown quickly sent new expeditions to secure the route and establish Portuguese authority. In 1500, Pedro Vaz Cabral set out with a larger fleet, aiming to follow da Gama's route and secure trade relations in India. Along the way, Cabral's fleet drifted far to the west and landed on the coast of what is now Brazil. This discovery would later become central to the Portuguese Empire in the Americas, but his main mission was in the east. Upon reaching Calicut, Cabral attempted to negotiate trade agreements. However, tensions between the Portuguese and the local Muslim merchant community quickly escalated into conflict. Violence broke out. Several Portuguese traders were killed, and Cabral responded by bombarding the city from the sea. Unable to establish peace in Calicut, he moved to Cochin, where he found a more favorable political environment, and established Portugal's first permanent foothold in India. This initial violence signaled the nature of Portuguese expansion in the Indian Ocean. Unlike the previous maritime powers of the region, Portugal was determined not only to trade but to dominate. This shift became even more apparent with the arrival of a new and decisive figure, Afonso de Albuquerque, appointed as the second governor of Portuguese India in the early 16th century. Albuquerque was a military strategist and a bold thinker. He believed that Portugal could not rely on diplomacy alone. Instead, he argued that it must seize key ports, control narrow passages, and build a naval empire that could ensure a monopoly on the spice trade. His plan was to transform the Portuguese presence in Asia from a series of trading posts into a centralized and armed imperial system, which would later become known as the Estado Donde State of India. In 1510, Albuquerque led a successful assault on the port city of Goa, which was then under the control of the Bijapur Sultanate, strategically located on the western coast of India. Goa had access to inland markets and served as a key hub for regional trade. Albuquerque made it the capital of Portuguese India. He expelled the local Muslim elite, encouraged the settlement of Portuguese families, and established Christian churches and schools. Goa would remain the center of Portuguese rule in India for over 4 centuries. After conquering Goa, Albuquerque turned his attention to the choke points of the Indian Ocean. In 1511, he captured Malacca, a vital port on the Malay Peninsula that controlled access to the Spice Islands and the South China Sea. The capture of Malacca gave Portugal access to the heart of Southeast Asian trade, and became a platform for reaching the Moluccas, the legendary Spice Islands in modern-day Indonesia. Albuquerque also sought to control the entrance to the Persian Gulf and the Red Sea. In 1515, he finally captured the island of Hormuz at the mouth of the Persian Gulf, which allowed Portugal to monitor and disrupt trade between Persia and India. His final goal, control over the Red Sea and reaching the Holy Land, remained unattainable, but his strategic vision left a lasting legacy. The Estado Donde was not a territorial empire in the modern sense. Portugal did not conquer vast inland areas. Instead, it focused on controlling key coastal cities and sea routes. Forts were built in Cochin, Goa, Malacca, and Hormuz. Naval patrols ensured the collection of taxes and compliance with trade restrictions. Local rulers were sometimes forced into vassalage, and at other times bribed or negotiated with. Portuguese officials established a system of permits cartazes which all ships in the region were required to have. Without them, a merchant vessel could be captured or sunk. This maritime licensing system helped Portugal dominate trade in the Indian Ocean, at least for a while. But dominance did not mean integration. The Portuguese often came into conflict with local customs, religions, and political systems. Their persistence in Christian proselytism, especially under the guidance of Catholic missionaries, sometimes led to resistance. Cultural and linguistic misunderstandings complicated diplomacy. Portugal's attempts to monopolize trade also created new enemies, especially among Muslim traders and rising regional powers such as the Ottoman Empire. Nevertheless, the short-term benefits were immense. Spices, silk, precious stones, and other luxury items flowed back to Lisbon. The crown grew wealthy, and Portugal's position in Europe strengthened. King Manuel I adopted a grand title, Lord of the Conquest, Navigation, and Commerce of Ethiopia, Arabia, Persia, and India. Lisbon became one of the busiest ports in Europe, filled with exotic goods and foreign ambassadors. The Portuguese Empire became undeniably global. However, this rapid expansion also carried risks. Maintaining distant outposts exhausted the crown's resources. Corruption and mismanagement spread among colonial officials. Many Portuguese soldiers and sailors died from diseases, poor conditions, or local conflicts. And although Portugal controlled certain ports and trade routes, it could not manage the vast territories beyond them. Nevertheless, the Estado Donde represented a bold and largely successful experiment of a maritime empire. It was the first sustained attempt by Europe to control trade in the Indian Ocean by force. It directly connected Portugal with India, Southeast Asia, and the Persian Gulf, and laid the foundation for further expansion into East Asia. By the beginning of the 16th century, Portugal had established itself as the dominant European maritime power in the Indian Ocean. The capture of ports such as Goa, Malacca, and Hormuz laid the foundations of the Estado de un Dia. Nevertheless, Portuguese ambitions were not limited to the Indian subcontinent or the Malay Peninsula. The next phase of expansion was directed even further east, toward the rich and powerful civilizations of East Asia. Portuguese sailors, merchants, and missionaries were lured by tales of untold riches in the East: silks from China, silver from Japan, and spices from the legendary islands of the South Seas. Much of this knowledge came from Arab traders and Asian intermediaries. Now, with a foothold in Malacca, the Portuguese had a starting point for moving east into uncharted waters. The first major goal was the Moluccas, known in Europe as the Spice Islands. Located in modern-day Indonesia, these islands were the source of cloves, nutmeg, and mace, luxury items highly valued in Europe. In 1511, even before the full conquest of Malacca, Portuguese expeditions began advancing toward the Moluccas. Competition for these islands would later attract other European powers, but Portugal was the first. By the 1520s, Portuguese ships reached the islands of Banda and Ternate. In these remote but economically vital regions, they negotiated directly with local rulers, built small forts, and tried to monopolize the spice trade. Although Portuguese influence was limited by distance and resistance from rival sultanates, they managed to maintain a fragile superiority through naval power and selective alliances. Meanwhile, attention shifted to the vast empire of China. Unlike the trading ports of Southeast Asia, Ming-era China was a centralized, bureaucratized, and strictly regulated empire. Foreign trade was limited and subject to the tribute system. Nevertheless, Portuguese merchants were determined to establish commercial relations. The first contact did not go smoothly. In 1515, Jorge Alves became the first known European to set foot on Chinese soil in the area of modern-day Hong Kong. Shortly thereafter, a Portuguese fleet under the command of Simo de Andrade anchored at Timau. However, their behavior offended the Chinese authorities. Reports of violence, smuggling, and even the kidnapping of children sparked tensions. In 1522, a Portuguese embassy to the Ming court, led by Tom Pires, suffered a catastrophic failure. Several Portuguese envoys were imprisoned or executed. For a time, it seemed that relations with China were ruined forever. But in the following decades, more diplomatic and cautious approaches prevailed. A turning point came in 1557 when the Portuguese were granted the right to settle in a small fishing village called Macau, situated at the mouth of the Pearl River near Canton, Guangzhou. Macau became Portugal's official gateway to China. Macau was a unique place. It was not captured by force but was leased through negotiation. The Portuguese paid rent to the Chinese authorities and received permission to build churches, warehouses, and schools. Over time, Macau transformed into a mixed community of Portuguese settlers, Chinese residents, and Macanese families of mixed descent. It became a hub of East Asian trade, linking China, Japan, and Southeast Asia with the broad Portuguese network. While China was cautious, Japan showed curiosity and openness to foreign influence. At least initially, Portuguese traders arrived in Japan in 1543, landing at the island of Tanegashima. The Japanese were immediately intrigued by Portuguese firearms, matchlock muskets, which they began to call Tanegashima and produce themselves. The introduction of European gunpowder weapons had a noticeable impact on the prolonged civil wars in Japan, known as the Sengoku period. Portuguese merchants brought more than just weapons. They introduced new goods such as silk from China, woolen fabrics from Europe, and silver from the Americas. In exchange, they acquired Japanese silver and copper, which they then used in other Asian markets. The resulting triangular trade between Japan, China, and Southeast Asia became extremely profitable. Religion also played a central role. In 1549, the Jesuit missionary Francis Xavier arrived in Japan. With the support of the Catholic Church and the Portuguese Crown, Xavier preached Christianity in several Japanese provinces. He was received with interest and hospitality by local lords, especially in the southern regions of Kyushu. In the following decades, Jesuit missions expanded rapidly. Thousands of Japanese were baptized. Some daimyo, regional warlords, converted to Christianity and allowed churches to be built in their territories. The Jesuits adapted their methods to local customs, learned the Japanese language, and sometimes dressed in traditional clothing so as not to alarm their hosts. However, this period of openness did not last forever. By the end of the 16th century, political unification under the leadership of such figures as Toyotomi Hideyoshi and Tokugawa Ieyasu led to growing suspicion regarding foreign influence. Christianity was banned, and Portuguese access was restricted. In contrast, the Portuguese never managed to establish a foothold in mainland Southeast Asia, Thailand, Vietnam, Cambodia. Powerful local kingdoms made dominance impossible. Nevertheless, Portuguese cultural and linguistic traces survived in the region from loanwords to architectural remains in coastal cities. By the middle of the 16th century, the Portuguese Empire stretched from Brazil in the west to Japan in the east. It was the first truly global empire in history. While the empire expanded in the Indian Ocean, another important front opened up in the South Atlantic. The discovery and colonization of Brazil, combined with interests on the African coast, created a second axis of Portuguese imperial power. The history of Brazil began with a voyage that was not originally intended for the Americas. In 1500, Pedro Alvares Cabral set sail from Lisbon for India, but his fleet deviated far to the west. On April 22, Cabral's ships sighted land the eastern coast of modern-day Brazil. Cabral declared the territory the property of the Portuguese Crown, based on the Treaty of Tordesillas 1494, which divided the non-European world between Portugal and Spain. Initially, Brazil seemed less promising than Asia. The first extractable resource was pau-brasil, a tree that provides a red dye, from which the country got its name. However, the potential for plantation agriculture, especially sugarcane, soon became clear. By the 1530s, the crown formalized its presence through a system of hereditary captaincies. In 1549, a centralized government was created, with its capital in the city of Salvador. With the expansion of sugar production, the need for labor grew. Initial attempts to enslave the indigenous population failed, due to the high mortality of the Indians from European diseases and their active resistance. This brought the Atlantic slave trade into the center of Portuguese politics. Portugal already had trading posts in Africa, Elmina in Ghana, Luanda in Angola. Now these ports became hubs for the export of people. The Portuguese did not establish deep territorial control in Africa, relying on relationships with African rulers who sold captives in exchange for firearms, textiles, and metal. By the end of the 16th century, tens of thousands of enslaved Africans were being transported across the Atlantic to work on Brazilian plantations. This forced labor became the foundation of the colonial economy. Despite the brutality of the system, African influence, language, music, religion, cuisine deeply penetrated Brazilian culture, creating a unique landscape. In Brazil, Jesuits also played an active role, founding schools and churches. By the end of the 16th century, Brazil surpassed the Asian territories in economic importance for Portugal. Sugar fed European markets, and African labor provided the power for this process. However, this prosperity attracted the attention of rivals. The Dutch, English, and French began to challenge Portuguese dominance. The spread of Christianity, particularly Catholicism, became closely intertwined with Portuguese colonization. Missionaries moved side by side with soldiers and merchants, bringing with them not only spiritual teachings, but also European customs, education systems, and cultural attitudes. The roots of this religious impulse lay in the medieval past of Portugal itself. The nation was born during the Christian Reconquista of the Iberian Peninsula. From its earliest days, the Portuguese monarchy maintained close ties with the church. By the time of overseas expansion, religious motivation was already part of the national narrative. Kings spoke of spreading the faith to new lands as a divine mission, and papal approval reinforced these ambitions. In the early stages of the empire, the role of the church was informal. Chaplains accompanied explorers and settlers to perform religious rites, but soon, official missionary orders became central figures in imperial life. Among them, the most prominent role was played by the Society of Jesus the Jesuits. Founded in 1534 by Ignatius of Loyola and approved by the Pope in 1540, the Jesuit order quickly became the intellectual and missionary wing of the Catholic Counter-Reformation. By the middle of the 16th century, the Jesuits had spread throughout the Portuguese Empire. In India, they founded schools and missions in Goa, which became both the administrative and spiritual capital of Portuguese Asia. St. Paul's Jesuit College in Goa became a major center of education and theological training, attracting students from across the region. Jesuit priests studied local languages, translated Christian texts, and sought to interact with Hindu and Muslim communities through dialogue and conversion. One of the most famous missionaries of this period was Francis Xavier, a co-founder of the Society of Jesus. Sent by King John E, Xavier arrived in Goa in 1542. He traveled extensively throughout the empire, preaching in India, the Moluccas, and even Japan. Known for his tireless energy and simple message, he baptized thousands of people and helped lay the foundation for Christian communities that would survive in Asia long after his death in 1552. Xavier's mission to Japan became one of the most remarkable episodes in the history of Portuguese religious expansion. Unlike India, Japan had not previously encountered Christianity. Nevertheless, within a few decades after contact with the Portuguese, entire communities had accepted the new faith, and some daimyo even became patrons of Christians. The Jesuits adapted their teachings to Japanese culture, presenting Christianity in a manner appealing to local elites. Churches were built, schools were opened, and catechisms were printed in the Japanese language. However, this early success aroused suspicion. Japanese rulers, especially during the period of the country's unification in the late 16th century, began to view Christianity as a threat to political stability. The presence of foreign missionaries and the devotion of converts to a distant religious authority caused concern. By the beginning of the 17th century, persecution intensified. Churches were destroyed, missionaries were expelled, and Japanese Christians were forced to go underground. The once flourishing Christian community entered a long period of secret existence and survival. In Africa, missionary activity developed according to a different scenario. In the Kingdom of Congo, the Portuguese Crown supported early conversions, and the Christian faith was adopted by some rulers and the nobility. The local clergy initially relied on Portuguese priests, but soon a clergy of African origin emerged, blending Christian teachings with local traditions. This gave rise to a unique form of African Christianity, shaped by local interpretations and resilience. Jesuits and other missionaries also operated in Angola and Mozambique, often in tandem with Portuguese military or trading outposts. Their efforts were complicated by the brutal realities of the slave trade. While some missionaries spoke out against the ill treatment of enslaved Africans, others remained silent or justified slavery as a means of converting non-Christians. The role of the church in slavery remains a deeply controversial aspect of its imperial legacy. In Brazil, the religious landscape became even more complex. Jesuits played a central role in the evangelization of both the indigenous population and African slaves. They founded missions called aldeias, where they attempted to convert and civilize indigenous inhabitants by isolating them from colonial society. These aldeias were often simultaneously spiritual centers and agricultural communities. The Jesuits taught farming, European customs, and Catholic doctrine. In the early stages, Jesuits sometimes protected indigenous peoples from exploitation by colonists. Figures such as Father Manuel Dombrega and Father José de Anchieta advocated for better treatment of indigenous Brazilians and spoke out against their enslavement. However, their approach was still aimed at cultural transformation and assimilation into European Christian norms. African slaves in Brazil were also targets for conversion. Baptism was required, at least nominally, and many individuals of African descent became members of Catholic brotherhoods known as Irmandades. These organizations offered a certain degree of spiritual and social support, allowing African traditions to blend with Catholic rites. Over time, Afro-Brazilian religions emerged, combining Catholic saints with African deities, a process known as syncretism. Religious festivals, processions, and public rituals became part of daily life in colonial Brazil. Churches were built in every major city, and the clergy possessed significant influence in both spiritual and political matters. However, the church also reinforced the social hierarchy. It rarely challenged the racial or economic structures that lay at the foundation of colonial society and often benefited itself from slave labor and land grants. The broad influence of missionary activity in the Portuguese Empire was both transformative and contradictory. Christianity spread widely and took deep root in some communities. Levels of education and literacy improved, and new cultural forms emerged thanks to the blending of traditions. But the imposition of religious norms also led to the erosion of indigenous beliefs, the suppression of cultural customs, and collaboration with imperial dominance. By the 17th century, religion was fully institutionalized within the imperial system. The crown controlled appointments to key ecclesiastical positions under a system known as Padroado Real, or royal patronage. This gave the monarchy direct influence over the church in overseas territories. Bishops and priests often performed the dual role of spiritual leaders and representatives of royal authority. Tensions between missionary orders and colonial officials were not uncommon. Jesuits, in particular, sometimes conflicted with settlers over the treatment of indigenous labor and the imposition of Christian morality. In some regions, they acted almost as a parallel government, especially where colonial administration was weak. Despite these frictions, the alliance of the cross and the crown remained a central element of Portuguese imperial ideology. Missionary work was used to justify conquest and colonization, to discipline the colonial population, and to ensure cultural cohesion in the sprawling empire. However, in the 17th century, Portuguese control over the empire was tested not by religious dissent, but by external threats and internal crises. In the next section, we will examine the Iberian Union and the consequences of the unexpected absorption of Portugal by the Spanish monarchy. By the end of the 16th century, the Portuguese Empire was vast, wealthy, and stretched across 4 continents. However, beneath the surface success lay vulnerability. The empire depended on long and fragile supply lines, a small population, and growing competition from other European powers. Domestically, political instability soon exposed these weaknesses. The crisis began with the death of King Sebastian in 1578. Young and inexperienced, Sebastian undertook a catastrophic military expedition to Morocco, attempting to revive the crusading spirit and expand Portuguese influence in North Africa. The campaign ended in failure at the Battle of Alçaqueba, where the Portuguese army was crushed by Moroccan forces, and Sebastian disappeared, likely killed in battle, although his body was never found. His death without an heir plunged the kingdom into a crisis of succession. The absence of a direct successor led to the short and unstable reign of Sebastian's great-uncle, Cardinal Henry, who himself died 2 years later, in 1580. In the absence of an obvious heir, several claimants appeared. Among them was Anthony, Prior of Crato, an illegitimate member of the royal family who was supported by many in Portugal. However, The most powerful claimant was King Philip I of Spain, grandson of the Portuguese king Manuel I on his mother's side. Philip I, already being the monarch of the vast Spanish Empire, resolutely asserted his rights. Supported by a well-organized campaign and the backing of many Portuguese nobles, who feared civil war, he invaded Portugal in 1580 and defeated Anthony's forces at the Battle of Alcantara. The Cortes of Tomar, Portugal's legislative assembly, recognized Philip as King Philip I of Portugal in 1581 under specific conditions. These conditions were intended to protect the autonomy of Portugal. They guaranteed that Portugal would remain a separate kingdom with its own laws, currency, and colonial administration. Portuguese positions in the empire were to be reserved for Portuguese subjects, and Lisbon remained the capital. Theoretically, the two crowns were united under the authority of a single monarch, but the two empires were to remain distinct. This political arrangement is known as the Iberian Union. For 60 years, from 1580 to 1640, the Portuguese and Spanish crowns belonged to a single monarch, Philip I, then Philip I, and Philip IV of Spain. Initially, this agreement brought stability. The Portuguese elite were integrated into a broader imperial structure, and the monarchy respected the formal autonomy of Portuguese institutions. However, the reality of the union soon became more complex. Despite the legal separation, Portugal found itself drawn into the broader geopolitical conflicts of the Spanish Empire. The most destructive consequence was the long-standing rivalry of Spain with the Dutch Republic. In the early 17th century, the Dutch, having proclaimed independence from Spain, began naval and commercial campaigns to capture overseas territories. Portugal, now linked with Spain, became a target. Dutch forces captured key Portuguese possessions across the globe. They occupied parts of Brazil, including Pernambuco and Recife. They challenged Portuguese dominance in West Africa, taking Elmina and Luanda. In Asia, they displaced the Portuguese from several points, including Malacca and parts of the Spice Islands. The loss of these territories dealt a crushing blow to Portuguese trade. The Dutch East India Company, founded in 1602, quickly replaced the Portuguese as the dominant European power in the Indian Ocean. Portuguese merchants struggled to defend their interests against better funded and more aggressive Dutch competitors. Meanwhile, within Portugal itself, dissatisfaction with Spanish rule began to grow. Many Portuguese felt that their interests were being subordinated to the interests of Madrid. Key posts, once reserved for the Portuguese, were increasingly occupied by Spaniards. Economic decline, rising taxes, and military losses deepened the dissatisfaction. By the 1630s, the situation had become unbearable. Portugal's autonomy was eroding, and the empire was shrinking. The final straw was the revolt in Catalonia, when the Spanish monarchy demanded more resources and military support from Portugal. The Portuguese nobility, already disillusioned, began to organize resistance. On December 1, 1640, a group of Portuguese conspirators carried out a coup in Lisbon. They arrested the Spanish governor and proclaimed John, Duke of Braganza, as King John IV of Portugal. The revolution in Lisbon was swift and practically bloodless, although conflicts continued in other parts of the country and the empire. The new king belonged to the House of Braganza, a noble family with legitimate dynastic claims. His accession marked the end of the Iberian Union and the beginning of a new Portuguese dynasty. However, independence had to be defended. Spain refused to recognize the Restoration and launched military campaigns to reclaim Portugal. The War of Restoration followed a prolonged conflict that lasted until 1668. Portugal received limited international support, particularly from France and England, each of which had reasons to desire the weakening of Spain. Despite unfavorable circumstances, Portuguese forces managed to repel several Spanish invasions and maintain control over their territory. The war also spread to the colonies. In Brazil, Loyalist forces fought to regain territories occupied by the Dutch. In Africa and Asia, Portuguese agents tried to return lost positions and restore trade networks. Although not all territories were returned, the Braganza monarchy succeeded in restoring a significant part of the imperial structure. The Iberian Union left a mixed legacy. On one hand, it brought temporary stability and linked Portugal with the largest empire in Europe. On the other hand, it exposed the fragility of Portuguese autonomy and led to the loss of strategic territories. This period highlighted that global empires cannot be easily unified without consequences. For the Portuguese, this served as a painful reminder that their empire, though global, was not invulnerable. After the restoration of independence, Portugal entered a new phase of imperial recovery. In the next section, we will examine how Brazil became the empire's most valuable possession thanks to sugar, gold, and the growing needs of European markets. The restoration of Portuguese independence in 1640 was a turning point in the history of the empire. While the Braganza monarchy reasserted national sovereignty after 6 decades of union with Spain, the global empire, in which Portugal once dominated, was now under strong pressure. Throughout the 17th century, to rising maritime powers, the Dutch Republic and England, mounted aggressive challenges to Portuguese colonial authority in the Atlantic, Indian, and Pacific Oceans. The Dutch threat emerged as early as the Iberian Union, when Portuguese and Spanish interests were merged under the Spanish Crown. The Dutch, rebelling against Spanish rule during the 80 Years' War, viewed Portuguese territories as legitimate targets. Although Portugal and the Netherlands originally had no quarrel, the union with Spain entangled Portuguese trade networks in Spain's broader conflicts. In 1602, the Dutch founded the United East India Company (VOC). This powerful chartered company combined private capital with state support and military force. Its goal was not only to profit from Asian trade but to dominate it. The Dutch quickly realized that undermining Portuguese control in the Indian Ocean would open lucrative markets for their own merchants. One of the first major Dutch victories was the capture of Malacca in 1641. This strategic port, previously conquered by the Portuguese in the early 16th century, was of decisive importance for access to the Spice Islands. Its fall dealt a symbolic and practical blow to Portuguese prestige in Southeast Asia. By capturing Malacca, the Dutch secured a direct link to the Moluccas and undermined Portugal's long-standing monopoly on cloves and nutmeg. Dutch campaigns were not limited to Southeast Asia. In the Persian Gulf, they formed alliances with local rulers hostile to Portuguese control. The Portuguese stronghold of Hormuz, once one of the jewels of the Estado don Dia, was lost in 1622. English forces of the East India Company helped the Persian Shah expel the Portuguese from the island, demonstrating the growing cooperation between anti-Portuguese forces. The Dutch West India Company, founded in 1621, began a parallel offensive. Their attention was focused on the Atlantic slave trade and access to gold resources. They captured the important fort of Elmina on the Gold Coast in 1637, and later occupied Luanda in Angola. These victories disrupted Portugal's transatlantic slave supply routes, threatening the viability of Brazil's sugar economy. Brazil itself became the main battlefield. In 1630, Dutch troops began an invasion of northeastern Brazil, occupying several key cities, including Recife and Olinda. They proclaimed the Dutch colony of New Holland, which they ruled for more than 2 decades. The Dutch West India Company tried to manage this area by balancing military force with relative tolerance toward the local population. The most famous figure of Dutch Brazil was Johan Maurits of Nassau-Siegen, who served as governor from 1637 to 1644. He promoted urban planning, scientific research, and religious coexistence. Dutch Brazil became a rare example of a more inclusive colonial experiment, with attempts to include Portuguese settlers, African slaves, and indigenous groups in a functioning society. However, Dutch control in Brazil proved difficult to maintain. Resistance from Portuguese settlers loyal to the Braganza monarchy gradually intensified. Armed uprisings, guerrilla tactics, and alliances with indigenous groups undermined Dutch authority. By 1654, After a series of military defeats, the Dutch surrendered Recife and abandoned their claims in Brazil. This victory was decisive for the Portuguese. Regaining control of Brazil ensured the survival of their most economically important colony. Sugar plantations, worked by African labor, continued to bring wealth to the empire. Nevertheless, the efforts to expel the Dutch were costly, and the empire was no longer the global power it once was. At the same time, English interests were expanding. The English East India Company, which received its charter in 1600, began to create its own network of trading posts and naval bases throughout Asia. Although the English were not as immediately aggressive as the Dutch, they sought to bypass Portuguese and Spanish routes to obtain goods directly. They established outposts in India, gained influence in the Persian Gulf, and ultimately established a foothold in Southeast Asia. While English attacks on Portuguese colonies were less frequent than Dutch ones, competition grew. English ships clashed with Portuguese fleets in the Indian Ocean. Diplomats and merchants maneuvered for access to ports and privileges in regions where Portugal had once been the sole European presence. The new maritime order became multipolar and increasingly competitive. In addition to military and economic losses, the Portuguese faced another challenge: the limits of imperial administration. The 17th century was a period of overstretched governance. The Crown in Lisbon struggled to send reinforcements, maintain fortifications, or pay salaries to officials scattered across far-flung territories. Corruption, mismanagement, and local uprisings exacerbated the difficulties. Some regions drifted toward autonomy. In parts of Asia, Portuguese settlers and mixed populations formed their own communities with limited oversight. From Lisbon, these communities continued to trade, marry, and pray in ways reflecting the hybrid nature of the empire. While Lisbon lost effective control, the Portuguese language, customs, and religion often persisted. One key example was Macau. Despite growing pressure from both Chinese authorities and competing European merchants, the city remained under Portuguese administration. It survived partly because the Portuguese adapted to local expectations, paid tribute, and avoided the provocative behavior that had ruined earlier attempts at interaction with China. In Japan, however, the situation worsened. By the 1630s, the Tokugawa shogunate had begun a full-scale suppression of Christianity and foreign influence. Portuguese missionaries and merchants were expelled, Japanese Christians were persecuted, and the country entered a period of isolation. The Portuguese were replaced by the Dutch, who were allowed to trade under strict conditions from the artificial island of Dejima in Nagasaki. This marked the end of Portuguese influence in Japan. In the Americas, Portuguese Brazil increasingly functioned as the central pillar of the empire. The loss of Asian ports shifted focus toward the South Atlantic. The transatlantic slave trade, sugar exports, and inland expansion became central points of recovery. The Crown encouraged settlement, supported religious missions, and established stricter administrative structures. By the end of the 17th century, the Portuguese Empire had changed radically. It was no longer the unrivaled maritime power of the early 16th century. It had lost many of its Asian and African strongholds, suffered humiliation at the hands of the Dutch, and struggled to compete with the growing power of England and France. Nevertheless, it also survived. The recapture of Brazil, continued control over Angola and Mozambique, and the persistence of cultural and religious influence in former territories allowed Portugal to maintain a global presence. The empire adapted, reorganized, and increasingly linked its future with the Atlantic world. By the middle of the 17th century, Portugal reasserted its independence under the rule of the Braganza dynasty. But this independence was far from guaranteed. The proclamation of sovereignty in 1640, led by John, Duke of Braganza, crowned as King John IV, triggered a long and dangerous struggle known as the Restoration War. This war not only determined the future of Portugal as a sovereign state, but also shaped the course of its global empire during a period of transition and recovery. The Restoration War lasted nearly 3 decades, from 1640 to 1668. Although the decisive action took place in Lisbon during a bloodless coup against Spanish rule, the real challenge was holding the restored kingdom against the might of the Spanish Habsburg monarchy. Spain, under King Philip IV, refused to recognize John's rights to the throne and was determined to restore control over Portugal and its overseas possessions. Despite the looming threat, the Portuguese people rallied around their new monarch. The Braganza claims were supported not only by traditional aristocrats, but also by merchants, the clergy, and ordinary citizens whose dissatisfaction with Spanish dominance had grown. John acted quickly. He created a war council, reformed the army, and sought alliances abroad. Realizing that Portugal could not win the war alone, he turned to other countries for support. The international context proved favorable. Spain was already embroiled in numerous conflicts throughout Europe, including the 30 Years' War, which drained its resources and divided its attention. France, Spain's main rival, provided Portugal with diplomatic and financial support. England, though initially cautious, later entered into a formal alliance with Portugal through the marriage of Catherine of Braganza to King Charles I in 1662. This alliance gave Portugal a powerful political ally at a critical moment. The war itself consisted of periodic skirmishes and large-scale battles along the Iberian border. Portuguese troops, often outnumbered, relied on strategic defense, knowledge of the terrain, and guerrilla tactics to hold back Spanish invasions. One of the most significant victories was the Battle of Montes Claros in 1665, where Portuguese troops decisively defeated a larger Spanish army. This victory helped strengthen Portuguese morale and persuaded foreign powers that the Braganza regime was here to stay. While hostilities continued in Europe, the Braganza government also took steps to restore control over the overseas empire. This involved both diplomatic recognition and direct military action. In Brazil, the Portuguese had already regained territories from the Dutch, but internal consolidation was still required. Colonial administrators strengthened defenses, improved port facilities, and encouraged immigration to expand the settler population. Brazil, with its vast lands and profitable sugar plantations, was now clearly seen as the cornerstone of the imperial economy. Elsewhere, the recovery was more uneven. Some territories lost during the Iberian Union were never regained. The Dutch retained control over parts of the Moluccas and disrupted Portuguese trade networks throughout Asia. In Africa, several forts fell, and the Portuguese struggled to restore their former influence. Nevertheless, the empire held on, and Portuguese sovereignty was gradually re-established in key regions, such as Angola, Mozambique, and Macau. One of the central tasks facing the Braganza monarchy was administrative reform. The 17th century showed just how fragile and overstretched the global system of Portugal had become. Communication between Lisbon and distant colonies could take many months. Corruption among colonial officials, inconsistent tax collection, and inefficient management weakened imperial cohesion. In response, the Crown took steps to centralize power and improve accountability. Viceroys and governors received clearer mandates, and oversight councils were created to monitor their activities. The Casa da India, which once managed all overseas trade and administration, was restructured for better coordination of naval defense, economic policy, and colonial law. Lisbon also expanded the use of royal charters and monopolies to stabilize income and control smuggling. Religious institutions continued to play an important role in the life of the empire. The Jesuits maintained influence in the spheres of education, missionary work, and mediation between settlers and the indigenous population. However, their power was increasingly scrutinized by the Crown. The state sought to balance religious influence and royal authority, ensuring that missionary work supported rather than challenged political goals. Meanwhile, the cultural and intellectual life of Portugal began to reflect a revived sense of national pride. Literature, art, and religious observances celebrated the Braganza dynasty and the resilience of the Portuguese people. Writers chronicled the heroism of soldiers and saints, while artists depicted the grandeur of the restored monarchy. The restoration of independence was presented not only as a political event, but as a divine triumph and a moral vindication of Portugal's unique identity. In 1668, after nearly 3 decades of intermittent conflict, the Treaty of Lisbon was signed between Portugal and Spain. The treaty officially recognized the descendants of John IV as the legitimate rulers of Portugal and ended the War of Restoration. Although Spain retained certain claims, it could no longer exert military pressure on Portugal without risking other losses in Europe. With the signing of the treaty and the securing of independence, Portugal could finally focus on the restoration and redefinition of its empire. The end of the War of Restoration marked a new chapter, a period of recovery, reform, and recalibration. The world had changed. The Dutch and English now challenged Portuguese trade on all fronts. France began to expand its own colonial ambitions. Portugal had to adapt to survive in this shifting landscape. Nevertheless, the survival of the empire was no small achievement. Despite military defeats, diplomatic failures, and economic difficulties, Portugal managed to restore its sovereignty and hold on to key parts of its global network. Brazil remained in Portuguese hands. The African slave trade continued to fuel the plantation economy, and pockets of influence in Asia still persisted. After the conclusion of the War of Restoration and the official recognition of Portuguese independence in the late 17th century, the country entered a new imperial phase. No longer an unrivaled maritime empire of the early age of discovery, the kingdom turned its attention inward to its largest and most valuable colony, Brazil. Over the next century, Brazil would transform from a peripheral plantation society into the economic, demographic, and administrative center of the Portuguese Empire. At the heart of this transformation were two powerful forces: sugar and gold. Sugar production had already been the basis of the Brazilian economy since the 16th century. The plantation system, developed first on the Atlantic islands and then expanded in northeastern Brazil, relied heavily on the labor of African slaves. By the end of the 17th century, regions such as Pernambuco and Bahia were deeply involved in the global sugar trade. However, the profitability of sugar began to decline. Competition from other colonial producers, especially in the Caribbean, put pressure on prices. Dutch and French colonies, in particular, produced huge volumes of sugar using increasingly efficient systems. Portuguese Brazil required a new economic engine to maintain its colonial enterprise. This new engine appeared, quite literally, from underground. In the late 1680s and early 1690s, explorers known as bandeirantes began to advance deep into the territory of Brazil, beyond the officially established boundaries of Portuguese control. These groups, often consisting of adventurers of mixed racial background and frontiersmen, were initially motivated by the capture of slaves from the indigenous population, but their focus soon shifted when gold was discovered in the mountainous region, known as Minas Gerais, literally general mines. The subsequent gold rush radically changed the colonial structure. By the early 18th century, Minas Gerais had become the most economically dynamic part of the colony. Thousands of migrants from both Portugal and coastal Brazil headed to the interior in search of fortune. Entire cities grew almost overnight, including Vila Rica, modern-day Ouro Preto, which became the epicenter of gold mining. The influx of people and capital brought dramatic changes. Roads were built linking the mining regions to the ports of Rio de Janeiro and Salvador. New settlements emerged along these paths, stimulating trade, agriculture, and the service sector. The Crown, seeking to control the wealth pouring from the land, introduced strict rules. All gold had to be processed at state smelters, where it was taxed at a standard rate, known as the quinto de royal fifth. Tax evasion was pervasive, prompting the creation of a network of inspectors and troops to ensure compliance. In some regions, gold was hidden in barrels disguised as food or melted into ordinary objects. The Crown responded with harsh measures, including confiscations and arrests. Nevertheless, the generated wealth was extraordinary. During the peak decades of the early 18th century, Brazil produced more gold than any other region in the world, and the economy of Lisbon became dependent on the flow of this resource. The social consequences of the gold boom were equally profound. Mining towns were harsh, diverse, and often lawless. They attracted people from across the empire: Portuguese settlers, African slaves, free people of color, indigenous guides, traders, and artisans. Social hierarchies were in flux, although white landowners and crown officials held power. Wealthy freedmen and entrepreneurs of mixed origin sometimes rose to positions of local influence. The demand for labor exploded. Enslaved Africans were forcibly brought to the mining regions in huge numbers, facing brutal conditions in the mines and surrounding settlements. While some gained freedom through savings or patronage, the vast majority lived in harsh and humiliating conditions. Slave revolts and escapes occurred in remote areas. Quilombos developed communities of escaped slaves forming parallel societies outside of colonial control. The largest and most famous of these was Palmares, located in the territory of the current state of Alagoas. Although it had existed since the previous century, Palmares grew significantly during the height of the gold rush. At the end of the 17th century, it was finally destroyed by Portuguese troops, but its legacy survived as a symbol of resistance and autonomy for Afro-Brazilian communities. In administrative terms, the Crown took steps to strengthen control over Brazil. In 1763, the capital was officially moved from Salvador to Rio de Janeiro, reflecting the shift of the economic center of gravity to the southeastern region. Rio became the gateway for gold exports, the administrative center of the southern captaincies, and the key point of communication between Lisbon and the interior. Portugal also tightened its colonial bureaucracy. A more professional class of administrators, tax collectors, and military officers was sent from Europe. Royal judges ouvidas and military commanders capitanes were tasked with carrying out the policies of the crown and suppressing unrest. At the same time, the church maintained a powerful presence. The Jesuits continued to manage missions, while the diocesan clergy provided spiritual oversight and education. Education in colonial Brazil was predominantly religious in nature. Jesuit colleges in major cities taught Latin, rhetoric, and Christian doctrine, primarily to the sons of elite families. Access to higher education remained limited, and most colonial Brazilians, especially women, indigenous people, and enslaved Africans, had little opportunity for formal schooling. Despite these limitations, cultural life flourished. Wealth from mining funded the construction of churches, the development of music, and architecture. Baroque art and religious festivals became central features of colonial towns. In cities such as Ouro Preto and Mariana, ornate churches were built using local materials and craftsmanship, often blending European styles with African and indigenous elements. The sculptor Elijah Dinho, active in the late 18th century, became a symbol of this hybrid artistic tradition. The intellectual climate also evolved. While censorship and religious orthodoxy remained strong, Enlightenment ideas began to filter into Brazil through books, correspondence, and returning students. Some members of the colonial elite began to question the rigid structures of monarchy, slavery, and overseas governance. These seeds of critique would eventually bear fruit in later periods of unrest. Portugal's reliance on Brazilian gold was both a blessing and a burden. It allowed the crown to pay off debts, fund European wars, and finance public works. Lisbon was rebuilt after the devastating earthquake of 1755, using funds extracted from the mines of Minas Gerais. But this dependence also made the empire vulnerable. When gold production declined in the late 18th century, due to the exhaustion of easy-to-access deposits and falling returns, Portugal faced new fiscal strain. Moreover, the centralization of the Brazilian economy caused discontent among regional elites. Conflicts over tax policy, trade restrictions, and political appointments intensified. colonial relations were increasingly perceived as predatory, bringing little benefit to the local population. The stage was being set for new forms of resistance. By the mid-18th century, Brazil had become something more than just a colony. It was the lifeblood of the Portuguese Empire. Its economy, population, and cultural development outpaced the indicators of Portugal's Asian holdings, and it played a dominant role in shaping imperial policy. Lisbon's prosperity rose and fell along with the state of Brazil's interior. By the middle of the 18th century, the Portuguese Empire faced both opportunity and crisis. Brazil had become its economic center, enriched by gold and sugar. Nevertheless, the empire remained burdened by inefficiency, corruption, and outdated institutions. It was in this context that Sebastião José de Carvalho e Melo, better known as the Marquis of Pombal, emerged as the most powerful and reformist figure in Portuguese politics during the Enlightenment era. Born into a minor noble family in the early 18th century, Carvalho e Melo rose through the career ladder in diplomacy and administration. Thanks to a combination of intellect, pragmatism, and political cunning, his career accelerated when King José ascended the throne in 1750, elevating Carvalho to positions of increasingly high authority. Within a few years, he became the de facto prime minister, wielding unmatched influence over both domestic and colonial affairs. The defining moment that gave Pombal full control was the devastating Lisbon earthquake of 1755. On the morning of All Saints' Day, a massive tremor struck the capital, followed by a tsunami and widespread fires. Tens of thousands of people died, and much of the city turned to rubble. Churches collapsed during Mass, and the royal palace was destroyed. In the face of catastrophe, King José stepped back from state affairs, and Pombal took over the reconstruction leadership. His reaction to the disaster was swift and decisive. "Bury the dead and feed the living," he reportedly declared. He mobilized resources, introduced martial law, and commissioned engineers and architects to rebuild Lisbon according to a modern, rational grid plan. The reconstructed capital featured wide boulevards, earthquake-resistant buildings, and centralized administrative facilities reflecting Enlightenment ideals, order, symmetry, and functionality. But Pombal's ambitions extended far beyond urban reconstruction. He saw the Lisbon earthquake not only as a tragedy, but as a symbolic rupture with the past. He used the crisis as a justification to revise the foundations of the monarchy, the economy, the education system, and the colonial apparatus. In doing so, he launched a radical program of reform aimed at strengthening royal power, reducing the influence of the nobility and the church, and modernizing the empire. One of his most controversial moves was the expulsion of the Jesuits from Portuguese territories in 1759. Although the Jesuits played a central role in education and missionary work throughout the empire, Pombal saw them as a threat to secular authority, accusing them of political intrigue, economic exploitation, and resistance to reform. He ordered their expulsion from Portugal and its colonies, confiscated their property, and closed their schools. In Brazil, this decision had significant consequences. Jesuit missions among indigenous peoples were dismantled, and their lands were transferred to the control of the crown or secular authorities. Although some missionaries protected indigenous communities from enslavement, their removal opened the door to increased exploitation by settlers and colonial officials. At the same time, Pombal established tighter control over the Brazilian administration. He restructured the captaincies, increased tax collection, and attempted to curb smuggling and corruption. Education reform was another key priority. Pombal sought to break the church's monopoly on knowledge by opening secular schools and promoting practical sciences. He founded new educational institutions, introduced standardized curricula, and encouraged the translation of foreign texts. The goal was to create a class of educated bureaucrats, engineers, and administrators loyal to the crown and capable of managing the complexities of an empire. Economically, Pombal sought to diversify and rationalize Portuguese trade. He created royal companies to regulate exports and imports, tried to stimulate manufacturing, and sought to reduce dependence on foreign merchants. In Brazil, he encouraged new industries such as cotton production, tobacco, and cattle ranching. He also tightened control over gold mining, strengthening regulations and expanding the role of state inspectors. However, Pombal's reforms were not without resistance. The old aristocracy, accustomed to privilege and autonomy, resented his policies of centralization. The clergy opposed secularization efforts, and many colonial officials were dissatisfied with his aggressive oversight. Pombal ruled with an authoritarian hand, using censorship, exile, and even torture to suppress dissent. His network of informants and police created an atmosphere of fear, especially after the so-called Vora affair. In 1758, King Joe survived an assassination attempt. Pombal used this incident to eliminate powerful noble families, primarily the Dvora family, accusing them of treason and conspiracy. Several people were executed publicly, and their estates were confiscated. This event strengthened Pombal's dominance, but exposed the ruthlessness behind his reforms. Despite harsh methods, Pombal left an indelible mark. His policy modernized the Portuguese state, expanded the power of the crown, and brought Enlightenment principles into the heart of imperial governance. Lisbon became a symbol of resilience and rationality, being rebuilt from ruins into a European capital that embodied Enlightenment aesthetics and centralized planning. In Brazil, the consequences were equally far-reaching. The colony became more integrated into the imperial system through new institutions, regulations, and infrastructure. The gold economy, though beginning to decline, was managed with greater efficiency. New economic sectors and frontier regions were opened. However, the removal of the Jesuits and the expansion of royal authority also led to increased tensions with local elites and indigenous communities. One of Pombal's more ambitious colonial experiments was the development of the Amazon region. He promoted the colonization of the northern interior, encouraging settlements and trade along the Amazon River. New administrative units were created, and incentives were offered to settlers for migration. The goal was to establish Portuguese sovereignty over contested territories and counteract Spanish expansion from the west. However, the remoteness of the region and transport difficulties limited the full success of these plans. The era of Pombal came to an end with the death of King Jose in 1777. His successor, Queen Maria I, did not trust Pombal and dismissed him shortly after ascending the throne. Some of his policies were abolished or softened, but the institutional changes he introduced endured. His reforms strengthened the Portuguese state and redefined its empire in an era of enlightenment and economic transformation. Nevertheless, these same reforms sowed seeds of discontent. The centralization of power, expansion of taxation, and curtailment of traditional privileges caused resentment among colonists, merchants, and nobles. In Brazil, regional identities strengthened, and calls for greater autonomy began to emerge, especially as Enlightenment ideas about freedom and governance spread ever wider. The Marquis of Pombal remains a complex figure in Portuguese history. He is praised as a modernizer and cursed as a tyrant, but his influence cannot be denied. He rebuilt the Portuguese Empire at a moment of crisis, bringing it into line with new political and intellectual currents. His legacy would resonate in subsequent decades, especially when revolutions began to shake the foundations of empires throughout the Atlantic world. As the 18th century drew to a close, Portugal once again found itself in the path of powerful European forces beyond its control. The Napoleonic Wars, which engulfed much of the continent, shook the foundations of European monarchies and empires alike. For Portugal, these events triggered one of the most unusual moments in its imperial history: the relocation of the royal court to Brazil. In an era when European powers clung tightly to their colonies, Portugal made the unprecedented decision to move its seat of government across the Atlantic, temporarily transforming Brazil from a colony into the center of the empire. The initial crisis arose due to Portugal's long-standing alliance with Great Britain, Since the late 14th century, the Anglo-Portuguese alliance had remained one of the oldest diplomatic relationships in the world. 6. As Emperor of France, Napoleon sought to dominate continental Europe and stifle British commerce through his continental system, a blockade designed to prevent British goods from reaching European markets. Portugal, economically dependent on British trade, refused to comply with the blockade. Its ports remained open to British vessels, which prompted Napoleon to take action. In 1807, he reached an agreement with Spain to invade and divide Portugal. French troops under General Junot marched toward Lisbon, while Spanish forces prepared to occupy the southern provinces. Faced with imminent occupation and lacking the military strength to resist, the Portuguese royal family made a dramatic decision. With the support of the British Navy, they fled Lisbon in November of that year, embarking on a fleet of dozens of ships accompanied by thousands of courtiers, officials, soldiers, and servants. This exodus was not simply a retreat. It was a royal transplantation of the entire government. After a harrowing Atlantic crossing, the fleet arrived in Salvador, Bahia, and then continued on to Rio de Janeiro. In March 1808, Prince Regent John, later King John VI, formally established the Portuguese court in Brazil. For the first time in colonial history, a European monarchy ruled from the American continent. The consequences of this relocation were immense. Politically, it shifted the axis of the Portuguese Empire. Brazil, once the periphery, now became the imperial capital. Royal institutions were recreated on Brazilian soil. The palace, ministries, treasury, and foreign embassies were all re-established in Rio. The presence of the court conferred prestige and attracted new elites to the city. Government functions, from customs to diplomacy, now operated from across the Atlantic. Economically, the change brought major liberalization. In 1808, Prince John issued a decree opening Brazilian ports to foreign trade, ending centuries of colonial restriction under the exclusive Portuguese trade system. British merchants flooded the Brazilian market, establishing a strong commercial presence and accelerating integration into global capitalism. This move also stimulated infrastructure development. New roads, docks, banks, and printing presses appeared to meet the needs of the expanded administration. Culturally and socially, the transformation of Rio de Janeiro was dramatic. The city, which had previously been a colonial port with modest public buildings, became a royal capital bustling with aristocrats, soldiers, scholars, and foreign diplomats. The arrival of the royal family triggered waves of construction, including the creation of libraries, opera houses, botanical gardens, and academies. In 1810, the Royal Library opened to the public, followed by the establishment of a medical school and other institutions of higher learning. Nevertheless, these events also highlighted contradictions within colonial society. Slavery remained a central element of the Brazilian economy. While the court introduced European customs and Enlightenment ideals, enslaved Africans and their descendants made up a significant portion of the urban population and performed much of the labor that supported royal life. The opulence of the court stood in stark contrast to the poverty and inequality that defined Brazilian society. For the European territories of the Portuguese Empire, the royal relocation had mixed effects. With the monarchy physically absent, Portuguese resistance to the French occupation fell largely to local forces and British allies. In 1808, British troops under the command of Sir Arthur Wellesley, later the Duke of Wellington, landed in Portugal and began pushing French forces out. The Peninsular War, as it became known, lasted several years and devastated parts of the Iberian Peninsula, but ultimately led to the expulsion of the French. By 1813, Portuguese and British forces had retaken most of the territory, and the Portuguese government in exile retained its legitimacy. However, the experience of foreign occupation and the absence of the monarchy created new political tensions. Constitutionalists and reformers in Lisbon began calling for a written constitution and limits on royal power. These ideas echoed the broader wave of liberalism sweeping across Europe, following the French Revolution and the Napoleonic era. Meanwhile, in Brazil, the prolonged presence of the court raised new expectations. Brazilian elites, especially those in the southeastern provinces, benefited from the new openness to trade and the attention of the monarchy. They began to see themselves not merely as colonials, but as subjects of a shared empire. Many believed that Brazil should enjoy equal status with Portugal, if not full autonomy. In 1815, in response to growing pressure, Prince John elevated Brazil to the rank of a co-equal kingdom within the newly declared United Kingdom of Portugal, Brazil, and the Algarves. This change formally ended Brazil's status as a colony and acknowledged its central role in the empire. However, it also raised the question, if Brazil was no longer a colony, should it not govern itself more directly? That question became more urgent when King John VI finally returned to Portugal in 1821, pressured by liberal revolutionaries in Lisbon and faced with unrest in Europe. He left his son Dom Pedro as regent in Brazil. The return of the monarch to Portugal was meant to restore order and reassert traditional authority, but instead, it triggered a chain of events that would lead to Brazil's independence. The relocation of the court to Brazil reshaped the empire in ways no one had fully foreseen. It brought unprecedented development, institutional growth, and political sophistication to the colony. It introduced liberal economic policies and exposed Brazilians to European political debates. Most importantly, it showed that governance could take place outside the metropole. When the king left, he did not take the empire with him. Brazil remained strong, organized, and increasingly self-aware. When King John VI returned to Portugal in 1821, he left behind more than just an administrative structure in Brazil. He left behind a transformed society. During the 13 years of royal residence, Brazil evolved from a dependent colony into a kingdom with its own political institutions, elite networks, and sense of identity. Now, with the monarch back in Lisbon and his son Dom Pedro acting as regent, the balance between Portugal and Brazil entered a period of tension that ultimately led to rupture. The immediate cause of this tension lay in conflicting political visions in Portugal. The Liberal Revolution of 1820 established a constitutional framework aimed at limiting royal power and centralizing the empire under the Cortes in Lisbon. The new constitution, promoted by Portuguese liberals and military officers, called for the return of the king and the subordination of Brazil to Portugal's National Assembly. This move directly contradicted the elevated status that Brazil had achieved as a co-equal kingdom in 1815. From the perspective of Brazilian elites, landowners, merchants, and professionals, the reforms proposed by the Portuguese Cortes threatened their autonomy and the gains made during the royal court's residence in Rio de Janeiro. The reimposition of colonial status was not only a legal change, it implied a loss of power, economic freedom, and symbolic recognition. Many feared a return to the restrictive mercantile system and subservience to Lisbon's dictates. Dom Pedro, the Prince Regent of Brazil, found himself at the center of this constitutional struggle, pressured by the Cortes to return to Portugal and dissolve the Brazilian regency. He was also lobbied by Brazilian factions urging him to resist. After several months of deliberation and public demonstrations in his favor, Dom Pedro made a historic choice. On January 9, 1822, he announced his decision to remain in Brazil. This moment went down in history as the Dia do Fico, or I am staying day. This act of defiance marked a point of no return. Over the following months, Dom Pedro dismissed Portuguese officials loyal to the Cortes, convened a constituent assembly in Brazil, and reorganized the army under local leadership. As tensions escalated, both sides prepared for confrontation. The Cortes continued to demand submission, while Brazilian leaders increasingly pushed for full independence. On September 7, 1822, while traveling in the province of São Paulo, Dom Pedro received new orders from Lisbon, confirming Portugal's intention to reassert control. In response, he reportedly drew his sword and declared, "Independentio morti," independence or death. That same day, he formally proclaimed Brazil's independence from Portugal. In December of that year, Dom Pedro was crowned Emperor Pedro I of Brazil, founding a constitutional monarchy separate from the Portuguese crown. The new empire retained much of the political structure inherited from the earlier royal courts, including a centralized administration, an imperial army, and strong executive power. However, it now operated under a Brazilian flag, with loyalty directed toward Rio de Janeiro rather than Lisbon. The proclamation of independence was not universally embraced. In several provinces, especially in the north and northeast, Portuguese loyalist forces resisted the new imperial authority. Armed conflicts broke out in Bahia, Manho, Pa, and other regions, requiring military intervention by pro-independence forces. The War for Independence lasted until late 1823 with varying degrees of violence and negotiation. Eventually, most Portuguese troops surrendered or were expelled. Portugal itself was in no position to wage a full-scale colonial war. The kingdom was still recovering from political instability and had limited resources to project power across the Atlantic. In 1825, under pressure from Great Britain, Portugal officially recognized Brazil's independence in exchange for financial compensation and diplomatic concessions. This marked the end of more than 3 centuries of Portuguese rule in South America. The loss of Brazil dealt a heavy blow to the Portuguese Empire. Brazil had been its largest, richest, and most populous colony. The empire's Atlantic structure, built on sugar, gold, and the transatlantic slave trade, was fractured. Without Brazil, Portugal's remaining colonies in Africa and Asia assumed greater importance. But none could match Brazil's strategic or economic significance. Politically, the independence of Brazil exposed the limits of metropolitan control over overseas territories. During an age of constitutional change and national awakening, liberalism, Enlightenment thought, and the example of other independence movements across the Americas combined to undermine the legitimacy of colonial rule. Even within monarchies, the principle of representative government and national self-determination was gaining ground. For Brazil, independence did not bring an immediate transformation of society. Slavery continued, and political power remained concentrated among landowning elites. However, the rupture with Portugal allowed for the emergence of a distinct national identity built around the imperial court, a Portuguese-speaking majority, and shared territorial ambitions. Brazil would become one of the few post-colonial states in the Americas to remain a monarchy, at least for the rest of the 19th century. In Portugal, the loss of Brazil prompted a reassessment of imperial priorities. The monarchy, weakened by political division and economic hardship, turned its attention toward its African colonies, particularly Angola and Mozambique. These territories, once considered peripheral, would become central to a second wave of Portuguese imperialism in the decades to come. At the same time, cultural and personal ties between Portugal and Brazil remained strong. Portuguese immigrants continued to settle in Brazil, trade relations endured, and members of the royal family maintained influence on both sides of the Atlantic. The imperial breakup was political, but it did not mean a complete severance of social and economic bonds. The collapse of Portugal's first global empire was not a sudden fall but a turning point. The transition from colonial domination to independent nationhood in Brazil represented the end of an era defined by maritime expansion, royal absolutism, and mercantile economics. What followed was a new phase in Portuguese imperial history, one focused less on oceanic navigation and more on continental consolidation. With the loss of Brazil in the early 19th century, Portugal's first global empire effectively ceased to exist. The wealth, population, and strategic influence of its South American possession far surpassed all other colonial holdings. But Portugal was not ready to surrender its imperial ambitions. As the 19th century progressed, Lisbon began to look elsewhere for imperial revival and found its answer in Africa. For centuries, Portugal had maintained a patchwork presence along the African coast, especially in Angola and Mozambique. These territories were involved primarily in the Atlantic slave trade and small-scale commerce. Yet, they were never fully colonized in the European sense of the word. Portuguese control remained coastal and limited in reach. The interiors were largely autonomous, ruled by African kingdoms, local leaders, or mixed populations beyond Lisbon's effective authority. The situation began to change during the last quarter of the 19th century, when a new phase of European imperialism, known as the Scramble for Africa, transformed the political geography of the continent. Driven by industrialization, competition among European powers, and a belief in the civilizing mission, countries such as Britain, France, Germany, and Belgium rapidly sought to acquire and formalize territorial claims across Africa. Portugal, though no longer a great power, feared being left behind. The monarchy and ruling elite were determined to retain international relevance and assert a legacy of discovery and expansion that dated back to the 15th century. With limited military and financial capacity, Portugal embarked on a campaign of diplomatic lobbying, exploratory missions, and administrative formalization aimed at securing large contiguous territories in Africa. One of the central ambitions of Portuguese policy during this period was to connect its two main African colonies, Angola in the west and Mozambique in the east, across the interior of the continent. This vision, often referred to as the Pink Map Mapa Cor-de-Rosa, envisioned a horizontal swath of Portuguese-controlled land stretching from the Atlantic Ocean to the Indian Ocean. Lisbon argued that centuries of presence along the coasts gave it historic rights to the hinterlands. However, this ambition collided with British plans for a north-to-south railway connecting Cairo in Egypt to Cape Town in South Africa. The British route would pass directly through the Central African territories claimed by Portugal. Tensions reached a peak in 1890, when Britain issued an ultimatum demanding Portugal's withdrawal from contested areas in present-day Malawi and Zambia. The Portuguese government, under pressure and lacking international support, was forced to concede. The diplomatic humiliation sparked widespread outrage in Portugal and contributed to domestic instability. Nationalists accused the monarchy of weakness, and Republican sentiment gained momentum. Though the dream of a trans-African Portuguese empire was abandoned, the episode demonstrated how Portugal's colonial aspiration had become central to its national identity, even as its resources remained limited. Following the British ultimatum, Portugal moved to consolidate what territory it still held. This marked the beginning of a more systematic effort to establish colonial rule in Angola and Mozambique. Earlier trade posts and missionary stations were transformed into administrative centers. The Portuguese began building roads, telegraph lines, and railways, though always at a much slower pace than other colonial powers. A growing number of European settlers, though never large in number, arrived to pursue agriculture and commercial opportunities. The formalization of rule also meant greater involvement in military campaigns. Many regions resisted Portuguese expansion, especially in the interiors where African polities had long maintained their independence. In Angola, resistance came from groups such as the Ovimbundu and the Congo. In Mozambique, the Goza Empire under Gungun Hana mounted strong opposition. Portugal responded with brutal force, using European officers, African conscripts, and alliances with rival local leaders to subdue resistance. By the early 20th century, Portugal had succeeded in extending nominal control over much of Angola and Mozambique, though real power remained uneven. Large parts of both colonies were administered through a system of indirect rule, or economic concessions granted to private companies. These companies, such as the Mozambique Company Companhia de Moambique and the Niassa Company Companhia do Niassa, were granted wide-ranging powers, including tax collection, land expropriation, and forced labor. In return, they were expected to develop infrastructure and produce profits for the empire. The human cost of this arrangement was immense. African populations were subjected to harsh labor regimes, received low wages, and had limited access to education or legal protection. Forced labor, known as chibolo, became a widespread practice. Many men were compelled to work on plantations, in mines, or on railway construction under threat of violence or imprisonment. Women and children bore the brunt of disrupted communities, food shortages, and social dislocation. Portugal defended its colonial practices with the rhetoric of civilization and progress. Lisbon presented itself as a benevolent power, bringing Christianity, the Portuguese language, and modernity to Africa. Missionary activity expanded and schools were established, though only a small fraction of Africans received formal education. In reality, the colonial system prioritized resource extraction and racial hierarchy over development or human rights. The imperial revival in Africa also affected Portugal itself. The monarchy used colonial successes to bolster its domestic legitimacy, presenting the empire as a source of national pride. School textbooks, public monuments, and international exhibitions celebrated Portuguese explorers, missionaries, and administrators. However, this reliance on colonial glory could not mask the deepening political and economic crises at home. The late 19th and early 20th centuries were marked by rising republicanism, labor unrest, and declining royal authority. The monarchy, already weakened by repeated scandals and perceived failures, could not withstand growing public dissatisfaction. In 1910, the Portuguese monarchy was overthrown in a peaceful revolution, and the First Republic was proclaimed. The new republican regime inherited the colonial empire and remained committed to its expansion. Colonial governors were reshuffled, legal reforms were introduced, and symbolic ties to the monarchy were removed. However, the underlying structure of exploitation, racial inequality, and economic dependency remained unchanged. The republic's limited resources and ongoing instability meant that colonial policy continued to be reactive, underfunded, and uneven. Despite these challenges, Portugal maintained its African colonies, while most other European powers moved toward gradual reform or eventual decolonization. By the early 20th century, Angola and Mozambique had become the core of what historians call Portugal's Second Empire, an empire based not on maritime exploration, but on territorial occupation and direct rule. In addition to Angola and Mozambique, Portugal also retained smaller colonies in Africa, including Guinea-Bissau, Cape Verde, and São Tomé and Príncipe. Although less prominent, these territories played roles in trade, labor supply, and naval strategy. In Asia, only tiny enclaves remained, such as Macau in China and Portuguese Timor in Southeast Asia. These were reminders of a once global empire, now largely concentrated in Africa. Portugal's participation in the scramble for Africa extended its imperial lifespan by several decades. Yet, this renewed empire remained fragile, marked by contradictions between rhetoric and reality, ambition and capacity. The African colonies were geographically vast, socially diverse, and economically underdeveloped. Portuguese rule rested on coercion and dependency, not on genuine partnership or modernization. With the fall of the Portuguese monarchy in 1910 and the rise of the First Republic, Portugal entered a new political era at home, but the structure of its colonial empire remained largely unchanged. The new republican government promised liberal reforms, education, and progress both in mainland Portugal and across the empire. However, its approach to colonial governance often reproduced the same authoritarian and exploitative patterns that had existed under royal rule. While the language of imperial legitimacy shifted from divine monarchy to national progress, the underlying logic of domination persisted. In Africa, Portugal continued to rule over Angola, Mozambique, Guinea-Bissau, Cape Verde, and São Tomé and Príncipe. In Asia, the small enclaves of Macau and Portuguese Timor remained, though their strategic and economic relevance had declined significantly. These overseas territories now formed the heart of the Portuguese Second Empire, land-based, resource extraction-focused empire that increasingly stood apart from the changing global mood of the early 20th century. One of the immediate challenges for the new republic was administrative control. The political instability that plagued Portugal throughout the First Republic, characterized by frequent changes of government, military coups, and internal dissent, limited the state's ability to reform or even consistently govern its colonies. Colonial administration was often left to local governors, private companies, and missionaries who operated with considerable autonomy and, in many cases, impunity. Despite Republican promises of modernization and equality, most African subjects remained disenfranchised. The vast majority were denied citizenship, education, or legal protection. A racial hierarchy persisted, with white settlers and Portuguese officials at the top, mixed-race populations occupying ambiguous positions in the middle, and the African majority subjected to forced labor, taxation, and limited mobility. The system of indigenato, native status, codified this inequality by placing natives under separate laws and restricting their access to civil rights. Education, while promoted rhetorically, remained scarce. Schools were largely run by Catholic missions and offered basic literacy and religious instruction. Access to secondary or higher education was rare for Africans, and the curriculum emphasized obedience, manual labor, and loyalty to the empire. The goal was not to foster intellectual development or critical thinking, but to create a class of low-level clerks, interpreters, and servants. Economically, the Portuguese colonies remained heavily oriented toward resource extraction. Angola became a center for coffee, cotton, and diamonds. Mozambique produced cashews, sugar, and tea, while also serving as a labor reserve for neighboring British territories. Guinea-Bissau exported peanuts and timber. These economies were shaped not by internal development, but by the demands of European markets and the interests of Portuguese companies. The labor system, nominally reformed under the Republic, continued to rely on coercion. Forced labor, whether labeled as taxation, public works, or obligatory service, remained widespread. African men were often conscripted for months at a time, separated from their families, and subjected to poor conditions and harsh discipline. Resistance took many forms, including desertion, sabotage, flight to neighboring colonies, and local revolts. Despite these pressures, African societies adapted and responded. In towns and villages, people built informal economies, preserved cultural traditions, and engaged in quiet acts of resistance. Christian churches, particularly those led by African pastors, became centers of community life and political discussion. In some regions, urbanization and wage labor gave rise to a small but growing African working class, with connections to global labor movements and political ideologies. Meanwhile, the world was changing. The First World War, though centered in Europe, had consequences for the Portuguese Empire. Portugal joined the war on the side of the Allies in 1916 and deployed troops to fight in both Europe and Africa. In Angola and Mozambique, Portuguese forces clashed with German colonial troops, often involving African conscripts and porters who bore the brunt of the hardships. The war exposed the vulnerabilities of colonial control and disrupted economic production, while also heightening awareness of global political currents. After the war, the Treaty of Versailles confirmed Portugal's sovereignty over its African territories, but it also marked the beginning of new international scrutiny. The League of Nations, and later the United Nations, promoted ideas of self-determination and human rights, putting pressure on colonial powers to justify their rule. Portugal, however, remained committed to its imperial mission, framing it as a civilizing project rather than colonial domination. In the interwar years, African nationalism began to stir, albeit quietly. Educated elites in Angola, Mozambique, and Guinea-Bissau formed cultural associations, published newspapers, and engaged with ideas from Pan-Africanism, socialism, and anti-colonial movements elsewhere in the world. Although these early efforts were often limited in scope and repressed by colonial authorities, they laid the intellectual and organizational groundwork for future independence struggles. The Second World War further accelerated global shifts. Although Portugal remained officially neutral, the war disrupted trade, strained imperial logistics, and reshaped the balance of power. In the post-war period, decolonization swept across Asia and Africa. India gained independence from Britain in 1947. Ghana followed in 1957. One by one, colonial empires began to collapse. Portugal, however, resisted this tide. Unlike Britain or France, which sought gradual exit strategies or negotiated transitions, Portugal clung to its empire under the Estado Novo new state regime, an authoritarian dictatorship. Established by António de Oliveira Salazar in the 1930s, the Portuguese state doubled down on its imperial identity. The colonies were rebranded not as territories, but as overseas provinces, integral parts of the nation rather than foreign possessions. This rebranding did little to change the reality on the ground. Racial discrimination, economic exploitation, and political repression continued. In fact, under Salazar, censorship intensified, civil liberties were curtailed, and anti-colonial activism was harshly punished. African demands for rights or autonomy were labeled as communist or subversive, and met with surveillance, arrests, and exile. By the mid-20th century, the contradictions were becoming unsustainable. While the rest of the world moved toward decolonization, Portugal insisted on maintaining a 19th century vision of empire. The result would be a series of brutal colonial wars in Angola, Mozambique, and Guinea-Bissau that defined the final decades of Portuguese imperialism. As the mid-20th century approached, Portugal stood increasingly alone among the imperial powers of Europe. While Britain, France, and others moved toward negotiated decolonization after the Second World War, Portugal doubled down on colonial rule. Under the dictatorship of António de Oliveira Salazar and his Estado Novo regime, the Portuguese government clung to the belief that its overseas possessions were not colonies, but overseas provinces inseparable from the national territory. This refusal to adapt led to a prolonged and bloody conflict that would ultimately break both the empire and the regime that defended it. The Estado Novo had been established in the early 1930s following years of political instability. In the Portuguese First Republic, Salazar, initially appointed as finance minister, soon consolidated control and established a corporatist authoritarian regime that emphasized order, Catholic values, and national unity. Censorship, secret police, and the suppression of political dissent became hallmarks of the regime both at home and across the empire. In Salazar's worldview, the Portuguese nation was multiracial and pluricontinental. The colonies in Africa, Asia, and the Atlantic were portrayed as integral components of a timeless civilizational mission. Rather than being allowed to develop independent identities, the territories were expected to assimilate into a singular Portuguese cultural framework. Officially, there were no colonies, only provinces. This rhetorical move, however, masked a brutal reality of inequality, coercion, and political exclusion. By the late 1950s, this imperial fiction was coming under growing pressure. Across the African continent, nationalist movements were gaining strength. Educated elites, labor organizers, veterans, and intellectuals began forming political parties and liberation fronts demanding independence. These groups were often influenced by Pan-Africanist thought, Marxist ideology, and the examples of successful decolonization in places such as Ghana, India, and Indonesia. In Portuguese Africa, three main liberation movements emerged. In Angola, the MPLA and FUNA vied for influence in Mozambique. The principal group was the Frelimo, Front for the Liberation of Mozambique, led by figures such as Eduardo Mondlane and later Samora Machel, and in Guinea-Bissau, the PAIG, African Party for the Independence of Guinea and Cape Verde, led by Amilcar Cabral, organized a well-coordinated struggle. These movements, though differing in ideology and support bases, shared a common enemy: the intransigent Portuguese state. Initial demands for civil rights and autonomy were met with arrests, censorship, and crackdowns. When peaceful reform proved impossible, many groups turned to armed struggles supported by the Soviet Union, China, Cuba, and newly independent African states. The liberation movements began launching guerrilla campaigns against Portuguese colonial forces. The wars officially began in 1961 when an uprising in northern Angola resulted in the deaths of hundreds of Portuguese settlers and thousands of Africans in the violent response. That same year, India seized Goa, Daman, and Dio, Portugal's remaining enclaves in the subcontinent, dealing a humiliating blow to Lisbon's imperial pride. The next year, full-scale insurgencies erupted in Guinea-Bissau and Mozambique. What followed was over a decade of relentless warfare, known in Portugal as the Guerra do Ultramar, or Overseas War. In Angola, Mozambique, and Guinea-Bissau, Portuguese forces faced guerrilla tactics, ambushes, and sabotage in remote and difficult terrain. Despite being under-resourced compared to other European powers, Portugal committed hundreds of thousands of troops to the conflicts, including large numbers of conscripted soldiers. The cost was enormous. The wars drained the Portuguese economy, consumed more than half the national budget, and isolated Portugal diplomatically. The country remained under international sanctions and was condemned by the United Nations for its refusal to decolonize. Domestically, the regime maintained tight control, suppressing anti-war sentiments and outlawing political opposition. Yet, resistance within Portugal began to grow. The long duration of the wars, combined with the compulsory military service imposed on young men, created widespread disillusionment. Thousands of Portuguese citizens emigrated to avoid the draft or seek better opportunities abroad. Underground political movements, student protests, and dissident voices in the clergy began to challenge the moral and strategic justification for the empire. In the colonies, the cost was even higher. Entire regions were militarized, villages were destroyed or forcibly relocated, schools and hospitals were rare, and infrastructure existed mainly to serve the military or extractive industries. Meanwhile, the liberation movements gained legitimacy and support among the local populations. In Guinea-Bissau, the PAIG established liberated zones where schools, clinics, and a basic administration operated, earning international recognition for its effectiveness. Salazar, who was becoming increasingly old and ill, was succeeded in the late 1960s by Marcelo Caetano. He promised limited reforms, but remained committed to preserving the empire. The war continued, and there was no end in sight. By the early 1970s, it had become the defining political crisis for Portugal, a crisis that neither military victory nor superficial reforms could resolve. The decisive shift occurred not on the battlefield, but within the Portuguese armed forces themselves. A group of younger officers, many of whom had served in Africa, grew disillusioned with the endless conflict and the rigid hierarchy of the regime. These officers, calling themselves the Armed Forces Movement (MFA), began to organize in secret. On April 25, 1974, the MFA carried out a peaceful coup in Lisbon known as the Carnation Revolution. The uprising quickly gained popular support. Flowers, not bullets, were placed into the barrels of soldiers' rifles as civilians flooded the streets. Within hours, the Estado Novo regime collapsed, and Caetano was removed from power. The revolution pursued several goals: restoring democracy, ending censorship, and expanding social rights. But central among them was ending the colonial wars. The MFA and the new transitional government immediately began negotiations with liberation movements across Africa. In rapid succession, Portugal recognized the independence of Guinea-Bissau, Mozambique, Angola, and Cape Verde. Shortly thereafter, São Tomé and Príncipe followed. For Portugal, the sudden end of the empire was simultaneously liberating and traumatic. Hundreds of thousands of settlers, soldiers, and families of mixed descent known as retornados, fled to Portugal, overwhelming the housing market and social services. Politically, the country entered a period of turbulent transition to democracy. Nevertheless, for many, shedding the colonial burden opened the door to long-awaited modernization and integration into the broader European community. For the newly independent countries, the legacy of Portuguese rule posed immediate challenges. Infrastructure was limited, economies were distorted, and political systems were underdeveloped. In Angola and Mozambique, rival liberation movements turned against each other, plunging the countries into civil wars that lasted for decades. In Guinea-Bissau and other former colonies, independence was followed by political instability, military coups, and economic hardship. Nevertheless, the end of the Portuguese Empire marked the final act of a long and complex imperial history. It was not a linear decline or a peaceful transition, it was a rupture shaped by war, resistance, and a revolution born from within. When the Carnation Revolution in April 1974 peacefully overthrew the Estado Novo regime, it not only ended nearly half a century of authoritarian rule, but also marked the beginning of the final phase of the Portuguese Empire. Within a few months, centuries of imperial rule in Africa collapsed. This was followed not just by decolonization, but by a complete transformation of Portugal's identity, economy, and place in the world. The imperial era ended, but its consequences continued to shape the face of both Portugal and its former colonies. Well into the 21st century, the new government, led by a transitional coalition of military officers and civilians, faced immediate pressure to dismantle the empire. The Armed Forces Movement (MFA), which organized the revolution, included many officers who had fought in the colonial wars and had become disillusioned with the endless conflict. These soldiers, along with civil society and emerging political parties, demanded an end to the hostilities and a redefinition of Portugal's national priorities. Portugal's new leadership initiated rapid negotiations with African liberation movements. In Guinea-Bissau, which had already proclaimed independence and controlled much of its territory, official recognition followed almost immediately. Mozambique, under the leadership of the Marxist-oriented Frelimo movement, gained independence in June 1975. Angola followed in November of the same year, although its independence was quickly marred by a brutal civil war fueled by Cold War rivalries. Cape Verde, as well as Sao Tome and Principe, also gained independence in that same transformative year. This mass decolonization was remarkably swift and, in many cases, chaotic. Portugal was not adequately prepared for a peaceful transition. The sudden withdrawal of the colonial administration, military forces, and settlers created a power vacuum in the new states. Nearly 500,000 Portuguese citizens, known as retornados, returned home within a few months, many arriving with almost no possessions, shaken by the loss of their homes, businesses, and status in the former colonies. The returnees created a deep social and economic crisis in post-revolutionary Portugal. Housing shortages, unemployment, and integration difficulties weighed heavily on public services. At the same time, their presence accelerated certain reforms. Many retornados brought professional skills, entrepreneurial energy, and cultural diversity, contributing to the reorientation of Portuguese society toward Europe rather than the former empire. Meanwhile, in the newly independent African states, the departure of Portuguese power brought both opportunities and hardships. Although political sovereignty was achieved, the legacy of colonial neglect left many countries without the institutions necessary for stable governance. In Angola and Mozambique, rival factions that had once united against the Portuguese now turned against each other. Civil wars broke out, fueled by Cold War competition, regional rivalries, and unresolved ethnic and ideological divisions. Portugal, although deeply affected by these events, was no longer an imperial player. Instead, it focused on the internal building of a democratic system, restoring a stagnant economy, and redefining its international role. The new democratic constitution of 1976 enshrined civil liberties and definitively broke with the colonial ideology of the past. Portugal applied for membership in the European Economic Community, which it officially joined in 1986. This move marked a clear turn toward European integration and a rejection of imperial nostalgia. Nevertheless, Portugal was not entirely finished with its overseas legacy. Two territories remained under its administration: East Timor and Macau. In East Timor, formerly known as Portuguese Timor, events took a tragic turn. After Portugal's withdrawal in 1975, East Timor proclaimed independence. However, Indonesia invaded and occupied the territory within a few days, citing concerns about a communist threat and regional security. A long and bloody occupation followed, marked by human rights violations, forced displacement, and resistance from Timorese independence movements. Portugal never recognized the annexation by Indonesia and advocated for East Timor's right to self-determination in international forums. It continued diplomatic work through the UN to keep this issue on the global agenda. After many years of struggle, East Timor finally gained independence in the early 21st century, with Portugal playing a key role in supporting this transition. The final chapter of the Portuguese Empire was written in Macau. Unlike the violent or abrupt transitions elsewhere, the transfer of Macau to China was discussed over several decades. Portugal had maintained control over this small territory on the southern coast of China since the mid-16th century, operating under a complex agreement regarding local autonomy and colonial administration. Throughout the 20th century, Macau transformed into a unique cultural and economic enclave, combining Portuguese governance, Chinese heritage, and international commerce. By the 1980s, both Portugal and China realized the need for a formal settlement. In 1987, the two countries signed a joint declaration, agreeing that Macau would be returned to Chinese sovereignty under the one country, two systems model. On December 20, 1999, the transfer of Macau was completed. Portuguese flags were lowered, Chinese flags were raised, and the last trace of the Portuguese Empire officially ceased to exist. This marked the conclusion of one of the longest-lived empires in world history, an imperial enterprise that began nearly 6 centuries ago with the conquest of Ceuta and the voyages of Prince Henry the Navigator. Since then, Portugal has sought to redefine its relations with its former colonies. Diplomatic, cultural, and economic ties have been restored through institutions such as the Community of Portuguese Language Countries (CPLP), created in 1996. It includes Angola, Mozambique, Cape Verde, Guinea-Bissau, São Tomé and Príncipe, Brazil, East Timor, and Portugal itself. This organization promotes cooperation in education, culture, trade, and diplomacy, transforming old imperial relations into partnerships based on a shared language and mutual respect. Within Portugal itself, the memory of the empire remains a subject of debate, reflection, and sometimes controversy. Monuments to explorers and colonial administrators still stand in cities like Lisbon and Porto, while museums have begun to reinterpret the imperial past in light of modern views on race, exploitation, and migration. Descendants of African, Brazilian, and Asian communities now form an integral part of Portuguese society, carrying with them the cultural heritage of a global past. The Portuguese Empire was never the largest or most populous among the European colonial empires, but it was the longest-lived. Its legacy spans continents, from sugar plantations in Brazil to trading posts in India, from forts in Angola to missions in Japan. It shaped the modern world through its early role in globalization, participation in the Atlantic slave trade, missionary zeal, and a persistent linguistic and cultural footprint. Entering the 21st century, Portugal did so no longer as an imperial power, but as a democratic nation striving for reconciliation with its past and cooperation with its former territories. The era of empires has ended, but the threads of this long history continue to bind people. cultures, and nations in unexpected ways. Unexpected ways.